Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and we're excited to talk to you all about our experience we just had going to Moonshine University. We're joined today by Director of Spirits Education for Flavorman and Moonshine University, Colin Blake. Colin, thanks for joining the Bourbon Lens today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for coming to class last week. It was really fun to have you both in there, staring me down with what I knew was just percolating with questions, and I'm going to get them with this come Monday.
Oh,
I saw it in your eyes every second of the class.
No, I think the best moment was you asked Scott to name another corn whiskey, and then Scott named a corn whiskey, and you were like, gotcha. That was the funniest thing that kind of happened. That I was like, oh, I was trying to think of a corn whiskey off the top of my head, and I couldn't think of one. So I'm glad Scott.
There's admittedly very few.
Yeah, it's kind of like when you're talking about the Scotch industry, and because single grain is a subcategory, people are just like, name a single grain. You're like, oh, of the thousands of brands, I know that there's only like a handful.
Yeah.
And I can't even think of one right now. I can only think of Greenore, which is an Irish grain whiskey. So, I mean, yeah. So the fact that you pulled out Georgia Moon after I already eliminated Mellow Corn, I mean, that's why you got 100 on the test.
Yep.
You obviously got the deep knowledge you need to be a superlative bourbon steward.
Yeah, and I got a 96. Mine's not as deep as his. Mine's just more surface level. Surface level. Woo.
Yeah.
It's too much peanut butter on the banana this morning.
That's why you're the looks, right? Like there's always the brains and body, and together you're the perfect package, right? Just look at you go. Look at you go.
We'll say that I have a face for radio.
Podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Social media has kind of made us come out from behind that a little bit occasionally, but it's all good. It's a ton of fun. Like, we've been doing this for 3 years, and you've been doing this for a lot longer, right? You've been in the spirits industry for a while, and the boom has been fun to be a part of, right? Like, and that's like some of the necessity of this, but like, for you, just having this, program, we'll talk about that more in depth in a second. Like, what's it like just to see the industry and distilling and spirits just grow exponentially over the last several years, for you and someone that's putting education together and growing that type of thing? What's it like for you?
It's super fun. It's one of those things where when I came into this, so I've been heading up Moonshine University for a decade now, pretty much since it opened. And before this, I only kind of had cocktail knowledge. So I did some research, writing, and I actually shot a pilot for a cocktail show that never got picked up when I was living in LA. And that was kind of my background. So more just kind of cocktail, general info about spirits. But when I got here, I fell in love with not spirits, but the spirits industry, because it is the most friendly, welcoming, just amazing, open industry I've ever had the pleasure of working in. So seeing it grow over this last decade has been amazing, because it's just like your family keeps getting bigger and bigger, and you like your family. I think the only thing that's kind of disheartening is when people come in and they don't have that same attitude that everybody else seems to have, of like, like we'll share all of our information. There's no secrets. How can we be helpful? And when people come in just, like they're eating food off of a tray in a prison, elbows out as fast as they can. They don't want anyone else near them. That's the only thing that's kind of a bummer that we didn't see 10 years ago. People that are just super competitive and just kind of being bullish, and not part of this spirits family. But outside of that, it's amazing. And it's really fun to have so many people come through Moonshine University, because we've helped over 190 distilleries open around the world now. So just having friends everywhere and anywhere we travel, professionally, personally, we have someone to reach out to be like, hey, we'd love to see you. Do you have any recommendations? So literally the doors get thrown open wherever you go, and you get to see a distillery, but then they'll show you around town and you meet, friends and locals wherever you go. So it's just such an amazing industry.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty eye-opening just getting there in the morning on Friday and watching some of the, the intro videos that you had playing while people were making introductions and, chatting before we started. And it's just like distillery after distillery after distillery. And, it's the founders and the distillers that have come through your courses. And now we're seeing their products out there.
Yeah.
And even as we were doing introductions amongst the class, what was it, 20 plus people? And there was people from distilleries. There were people from, the bar industry. There were people, podcasters. There were hobbyists, enthusiasts.
And it's amazing. So because when we started this program, we did not think we didn't think it was going to be what it became. We originally thought it was just going to be like a class that local bartenders took, and we'd run it once, maybe twice a year. And the first class was very much who we expected, people in the hospitality industry. But by the second class, it was already 80% enthusiasts. And we run it a lot more often than once or twice a year. Mm-hmm. The demand has been pretty impressive for that class. But I do think a lot of that is because we hang our hat on being unbranded. And we get really in depth. There are some things we did kind of an audit of the program and like what's working, what's not. And there's a couple things in that class that are way beyond the skill set of what should be in that class, but it's also the parts that people talk about the most and just love, like training on individual congeners created during fermentation. That's well beyond the scope of that class, but people love it. Yeah. I mean, the amount of times people have come up and just told me how cool that one aspect was is a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, and I think, one of the things I think that's really interesting is about the conjurers. Scott and I talked about, like, I picked up the phone and called him on the way home. I was like, man, I finally understand heads, hearts, and tails cuts. Like, it's been said in the industry. I've run a still with Ted from Starlight. Like, I've done it. But like I never understood it because he would just like put his hands underneath it and just rub it together and he would just smell it. He's like, still heads, still heads, still heads. Like, obviously he's been distilling for a very long time, so he can get that and get the smells. But like for me, I was just like, all right. And then he's like, try it. And you're like, ugh. And then you're like, try it now. And you're like, ugh. And then you taste it until you get it. And people don't understand pot distillation is a lot more difficult than column still distillation. Like once you got your heads, hearts, and tails all set up, cut, it's just going to run continuously like we talked about. But like, I just think there's something unique about craft that can, like, they're making their own cuts and they're smelling for those congeners. And now like I get what they're talking about. And then having that nosing profile afterwards, like will make it all the much more interesting when we're part of that still experience the next time out at a distillery.
Well, that's the hope, because again, as just the general consumer becomes more and more educated about the process, I do feel like there's those gaps where, so many people know heads, hearts, and tails, but, kind of like you said, they don't really know what that means. And also why during the aging section of the class, I spend so much time talking about oxidation in the barrel, because people don't realize how important that process is and all the flavors that come from that process. And I mean, they don't talk about it at distilleries, or they might, but in a very kind of high, falutin way. But there are a couple things that I really put in that class just because I think it's important for people if they really want to understand the spirit and where flavors are coming from and how flavor is controlled by the producer.
Yeah.
Why they're in that class.
Yeah, because in the distillery tours, you get, oh, well, here, we put this whiskey in a barrel and 80% of the flavor comes from the barrel. All right, moving on. Yeah. You're just like, what?
Yeah. They don't talk about the importance of the rick, the way the rick was built, like why there's those gaps, why there's airflow. Like all of those things make sense to anyone that's gone on maybe like a handful. But like when you sit down there and like break down like the actual process and processes that go along with it, it's really interesting because there's a lot of chemical reactions happening all the time. And people don't realize how many science people are really running the industry now. Like,
yeah,
it's not your just dude who just picked up a still and started going and figuring it out. Like it's people with like chemical engineering backgrounds.
Yeah, and that's one thing that we're really seeing a difference in the industry these days, particularly the American um, industry, where a lot of these more heritage distilleries, uh, where people kind of trained on the job, or their dad worked in the industry, so they came in, and um, that type of coming up in the industry. And now we're seeing, so many people start getting promoted in college and early on with, science and sensory and food science degrees, because those things are just elevating
Mm.
production, and particularly post aging, because there's just so much analytics that goes into what's happening in that barrel during aging, and how to make a more consistent product time and time again, which is, I mean, as you all learned, very hard to do.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I just find it funny, like when we talked about sourcing in the product, and like how people have to blend together, and you're going to have a different stock of barrels all the time. We talked about it with Lucky 7 last week. Like, you have to have someone really good. They have Ashley Barnes, like, have Michter's has Andrea for the Master of Maturation. You're starting to see more of those people really kind of come to fame, because, whether they started sourced and now they're having to use their own material and get those blends back. Like, it's a very innovative and very difficult process. And so those people are being raised up, and typically they're women nowadays, because they just have better nose and palates, like, than men, like, scientifically, like, that's being proven left and right. So I think that's super interesting as well.
No, and that's the truth. I mean, even before this, I was talking with Lindsay, who you met here when you were here, and she's our registrar, and just kills it at keeping us organized and everything running, and all the students who come through here happy. But whenever she gets invited to a triangle test at the Flavor Man, she just knocks it out of the park. So now she's invited to all sensory panels.
Yeah,
because she's spectacular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's so cool. Like, how, like, you all are working hand in hand, and helping people grow. And, like, it's just, you don't have to be the director of spirits education to be on the triangle test, right? You could just be anyone that just has the propensity of showing up and being successful at smelling and tasting, right?
Yeah. And I don't think we do it differently than any other company, where, everybody has different sense memories, everybody has different sensitivities, but everybody goes through sensory training here, just to get up to speed. And then at Flavor Man next door, and they have a much larger staff. They have 60 some odd people, but literally everybody goes through panels and training just to see who's good, who's not, who should be on which panels, who can be super sensitive at picking out geosmin or benzaldehyde or something else, so that if they're like, is this high, they can bring that person in and be like, how intense is it? So it's important. And that's what all the companies are doing, is really kind of bringing in a lot of people for that. Some are a little more myopic and have people on a path or hire specifically for that. But we still pretty frequently see people outside the lab do a lot of sensory as well.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot of peripheral things, and now let's talk a little bit about the demand for the class, right? So, you've been with Moonshine University for 10 years or so, and really, what is the Executive Bourbon Steward program? I think we've kind of hit on it a little bit. It's an intensive training, but talk to our listeners about what it actually is and what it isn't.
So the Executive Bourbon Steward is one of two different levels of the Stave and Thief Society. So we created the Stave and Thief Society in 2015. And really, there's two different levels. There's the Certified Bourbon Steward level, where you order our Bourbon Steward handbook. You can read it at your own pace, and whenever you're ready, you take an online test and you're a certified bourbon steward. So it's a study at home type of certification. And then the executive level is where people come in and do a super deep dive into all the different aspects of bourbon, from production, aging, labeling, a little bit into classification and legality. So we do a pretty deep dive, and we do hands-on in our distillery, so that we reinforce everything that you learn in the class, and we do a lot of sensory training. There are, what is that, 5-6 flights throughout the day that focus on, different grains, what happens in a barrel over time, heads, hearts, and tails, flight building exercises. So it's rather intense overall, but it's a nice unbranded journey through all of it, so that the information you get from that you can actually apply to every single brand. And we really are big on training on towards sensory, because even when we're training on aging, on production, we're talking about how that impacts flavor and ultimately how to make you better at sensory. Because that's one of the bigger goals for that class, is to help people become more comfortable with sensory and talking about sensory. Back when we let the class go as late as we wanted, which, I mean, sometimes it would start, at 9 and we'd be done at like 7 p.m. It used to be. So we had to start cutting certain things. We did an activity where we broke people into groups, and they got bourbons blind and had to actually do nosing notes, tasting notes, and how they work together. And it was amazing how the group of people at 9:15, when we did our first tasting, and I couldn't get them to say one descriptor. By the end of the day, they were just gregarious and, like arguing about what they got. So it's really satisfying to see that we're helping people become more comfortable talking about what they're finding with their nosing and tastings and other things, and be accurate about where those flavors are coming from, how they came about. So it's just a satisfying class overall, for me as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, I like that it was like constantly building. It just built on what you just talked about, and you learn about something, then boom, sensory tasting, like sensory experience. You learn a little bit more, and it impacts what you just learned. Then you go out in the distillery, and we're seeing that stage. So it really just builds upon. I mean, it's really, the curriculum is set up pretty well for an 8-hour course to get in a ton of information.
It's a ton. And it is a breakneck speed too, because originally I designed it as a 2-day class, and oh man, all the feedback we got was too long, has to be 1 day. If we're going to send staff, has to be 1 day. And also that was doubled with, well, what should we cut? And nothing. This is all great information. So it was like, okay, well, how do we put 2 days worth of information into 1 day? And that's why I feel the day goes so fast for people, because that's something I hear all the time of, like, I didn't know what to expect, but the day just flew by. Because we do pack it full of information, but you're always going in the distillery or doing sensory or watching a video to break up the day. So it does feel, even though it's a ton of information, it's not just sitting at a desk listening to me talk for 6 hours, which, even if it was, I mean, come on, that would just be delightful. I mean, all my jokes have just been dialed in over these last 7 years. So
worth the price of admission alone.
Oh man. No, I would say for me, like, that was the best part. It was never stagnant. Sometimes, like, when you're not in an education setting anymore, you have these adults, it's really focused on adult education, and that's a completely different level of education than teaching a high schooler. So I appreciate the interactiveness, the ability to talk in class, like interact with you along the way, because that keeps us engaged, because we're not used to being quiet for 8 hours. Like, we're used to asking questions and being engaged. And so, I appreciate just the learning aspect of it, as much as the information, and that people are probably like, learning and information, same thing. No, it's completely different. And so, like, for me, I just appreciate that, because I've been in enough seminars and enough, like, conferences and sat through enough keynote speakers to be like, oh, like, this is rough. Like, why are they making a bunch of adults just sit and not talk all day? It's pretty rough. And I don't know why we make kids do that anyway, but that's another tangent for another day. But what's really nice about that is it is 8 hours, but you all have expanded the Stave and Thief Society as well to do an online program. So what brought the demand for that online? it's not the executive bourbon steward, but it's the certified bourbon steward, if I'm not mistaken, on the title of the certification you get. So what's the difference, and why was that brought forward?
So we do have the certified bourbon steward, which is just the book, but we did launch the executive version online as well.
Okay.
Now, this is one of those, many things that was brought on by COVID. COVID really did make us go, you know what? We should do an online version because we didn't know what was going to happen to the world. But in typical us fashion, we came up with the idea. And because our team's so small and we're doing so many other things, by the time we were ready to launch the online version, built the new platform, Clay and I shot like 9 hours of video that's part of that class, and wrote the testing and the supplemental info. That we launched it in March of this year, so not when it was a COVID concern anymore. But we did realize as we were developing it that it beyond COVID, that it's a good option for people, because we do understand that this class is a high price point for a lot of people. But, some people don't understand the value of it. But once you come to the class and you see the facility, owning a distillery that doesn't make product is expensive. So having an educational distillery and just all the materials you get throughout that class and 2 meals, like we do feel like it's a value. But then for people traveling in, and you're paying for a flight, you're paying for a hotel, those prices can just start compounding quickly. So we did want to make it a little more accessible, and it's going to make it easier for international students. So ultimately, it's going to behoove the program overall, because one of our bigger goals for 2023 is to just keep working on Stave and Thief expansion, because there's only so much we can do with one classroom, one distillery. There's only one me, one Clay. I've taught that class about 125 times now. And that's great, but there's demand elsewhere. So beyond the online, we're also having our first class in January of people coming in who are going to get trained to be able to teach the executive bourbon steward level, so that they can teach both here at Moonshine University, and we're going to start certifying other distilleries around the country that can teach it as well. So we'll have different locations where it can be taught, and start really kind of working on expansion of that program overall. And once we kind of have that in place, we're going to start adding new spirits. So we're going to do Irish whiskey, Scotch whiskey, gin, mezcal and agave spirits. We're going to keep expanding. And then ultimately, we're going to start adding a higher level as well. So that we'll one day in several years after we keep working on the expansion plan, there will be a master bourbon steward, something that is above executive, where it's probably going to be a 2 or 3 day class. It's going to be sensory intense, and actually have an in-depth test where it's just beyond multiple choice, where there'll be essays, there'll be orals, you'll actually have to do sensory testing, things of that nature.
Mark your calendar, Scott. We'll be there when the opportunity strikes.
You wanna compete again?
Yeah, we'll compete. If we got an essay, I got a chance. You're a lawyer.
Yeah, how did that competition go at this last class? Are you all going to share that?
Scott got 100 and I got a 96. I'm okay with that.
He's a womp womp.
I got an A. I don't care. But that's the difference between a great whiskey and a good whiskey, right? Like, it's 4 points. So I'm just a good whiskey. Scott's a great whiskey. That's basically what it is. And Scott's great whiskey is JTS Brown for everyone. We'll just continue to remind you all that. My good whiskey is, I don't know, something that showed up in the mail, whatever that is, recently. And that would be Midwinter's Night Dram, Encore Edition. So haven't opened it yet, but that's going to be my good whiskey that I'll say that I am. Just a price point variance.
It's a pretty whiskey.
It is a pretty whiskey, and I am definitely not pretty. So, when you think about this and this expansion and growth, like I think that's awesome because not everyone's going to be able to get to Kentucky, but there's so many awesome distilleries across the country, whether it's like these hubs like New York, Colorado, Texas, like Washington State. Like there's a lot of these distilleries kind of popping up in these central areas. And I think it's cool because we're also going to start to get geographical differences in America on the whiskey production and bourbon production overall. And I think that's what's going to be a ton of fun. And so like you'll learn and get different flavor profiles and different thought processes in those, the sensory details because people will be from that area and grow. So I think that's super innovative and pretty cool that y'all are going to do that from an expansion standpoint.
Yeah, we're excited about it because right before COVID, the year before COVID, we were teaching it in other cities. So we partnered with distilleries. I taught it in Chicago a couple times, New Orleans a few times, New York once, but it was a lot to run this place and also try to be on the road teaching that class. So we ultimately came up with this expansion idea, and we think it's going to be much better.
Yeah. No, I think that's awesome. And you're teaching people to teach, right? Fishers of men of the bourbon world, which is pretty cool. So when you think about the person that is taking this class, like what should they expect to move on from that with? Like, is it just to be a better consumer and taster of their whiskey when they're at home drinking with their friends and educating friends? Or is there a depth that's going to take place past that for an individual if they're enthusiast or if they're, just someone that's working at a distillery or a podcaster like us? Like what would you expect them to take away and help them grow with?
Well, that's one of the things we're pretty proud of with this. It does have a wide breadth overall. I mean, it was a very challenging class to write overall because we also wrote it with the goal of zero assumed knowledge. So someone should be able to come in, and we do have people who come in. Generally, it's a spouse, and they're like, well, my spouse loves it, and they dragged me here. And they know nothing, but still by the end of the day, they have an appreciation for the spirit and can pass the test. So when people come in from all different walks, whether they're an enthusiast and they just want to get better at sensory or just have a better understanding of the process, we feel like they get that. And they'll be more confident with it and know how to continue to get better at sensory. And that's what we see a lot of the enthusiasts really interested in when they come to this class. And then when it comes to people in hospitality or in the distilling industry itself, a lot of what they are looking for is kind of that broad education. So if you're working at a distillery, you do one thing, right? And you kind of know all these other aspects that happen, but someone who's working in the blending lab might not know anything about labeling or what happens in the distillery. So you understand kind of the larger scope of the industry, and particularly if you're public facing and interact with tours or just people in general, it does give you that confidence of the education, because we do feel like we've kind of we've reduced everything to where it's meaningful, but we explain it in such a way it's very easy to understand, kind of grasp, and people can kind of repeat that concept, which is great, because I have been on many tours where I have heard my jokes stolen and have heard people say things exactly like I explain it in class. And I think it's great because that's what we're trying to do, is just make it very understandable in a very quick, succinct way.
That's a great point, because I remember, when we were doing introductions, there were a couple gentlemen that were from a distillery. They were in the accounting department. It's like, yes, they know everything about the financials and everything about, but do they really know about the whiskey? And that distillery, I believe it was Michter's, sent them to help them learn all those additional components that they otherwise might not ever have an opportunity to learn.
Yeah. And that's one thing that we see with that class. So we probably do So we do 12 public classes a year, and we probably do another 8 private classes a year. And that's just different distilleries that send their staff. Like there's some distilleries like Bardstown Bourbon Company where it's, like CEO down to the janitor is an executive bourbon steward. Everybody goes through that program. And then there's others where it's really important for, every tour guide to do it, or anybody in production to do it. But we're seeing a lot of the industry go through it just because it fills in all those gaps for people.
Yeah.
And it's also one of those things that as this has grown, there's things, because I wrote the program, I wrote the book, I'm very proud of it, but there are certain things that happen where you're just like, oh, and you're flattered and kind of like taken aback by it. Like the first time I was on a tour and heard someone kind of use my language, I was like, oh, that's amazing. But then I saw Stave and Thief tattoos start to happen, and that was a big like, oh, okay, this is a real thing. Okay,
yeah,
okay, we gotta service this group very, very, very well because people are committing to it for life.
They're making sure, like they're Iron Man, right? Instead of running and swimming and biking all day, they learned about bourbon and whiskey.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that is their badge of honor right there. Yeah. And then I also see on a lot of job postings how being an executive bourbon steward is a huge benefit for applicants, and so it's just kind of crazy to me how this program has just grown and evolved over time. And I'm very excited to, for the next 10 years of Moonshine University to see how both Moonshine U and Stave and Thief are going to continue to grow.
And that's one thing I was kind of thinking about. If somebody's even remotely interested in getting into the bourbon industry, the whiskey industry, hospitality, I mean, I think that taking this course and having that, certification that's from a reputable company and has, people know what it is now, and to have that on a resume, or to have that, come up in conversation when you're across the table from a distillery, I think that's going to be a big value. And, I recognize that because I'm a lawyer and we do continuing education, and I've got, certifications and things like that. So those are always beneficial to expand your, your web of knowledge. So I think for those type of people, check out either coming to Louisville to take the course or check out the online course.
Yeah.
Now, I know we talked about, price. We didn't talk about this specific price, but my understanding is it's $600, and then the online course is about $500. So it's a little bit
correct.
But in terms of, I think in terms of value, it's great. Like you said, you get breakfast, lunch, so you're there all day. Any snack you need, so you don't have to worry about anything. You come in and that's your full day. But aside from the education, there's other components. You get the book, which is great. I've gone back through it this weekend since the course. And then you also get the tasting kit. Does the tasting kit also come as part of the online certification?
It does. And it's a nosing kit. I want to make sure that you're not tasting anything in there. Don't taste it.
It is food grade, though, and just in case you do. That was a disclaimer that was made in class by Colin. It is food grade, but don't taste it.
But don't taste it. Don't taste it.
Some of it tastes pretty bad.
Yeah, so that was the largest challenge I faced. And probably what delayed the online certification for the executive level for a few months. Because I know what the value is for coming here for the in-person class. So I spent a lot of time figuring out, well, how do we add the value where we're not just taking things away? We're taking away the distillery experience. We're taking away most of the flights because we can't ship alcohol. So we had to really come up with that value, and that is something that was hard to tackle. But ultimately, we came up the convenience, the cheaper price, and it ultimately occurred to me that I'm not restricted by time. And that was a big thing with the in-person class. I've got 8 hours, so there's only so much information I can put in there. And, having taught it so many times and being respectful of everybody in class and their time, if there's a million questions, my wheels are turning of like, okay, well, I need to cut this story, explain this in a more succinct way, just to make up time. So the online version, I went into the weeds with everything. So it is such a deeper dive into every single topic that's really where the value of the online class that you don't get with the in-person one is there's no restriction of time. So we get super deep into yeast and the history of yeast and barrel aging and more into labeling and explanation of how to do sensory and things of that nature. So even though it seems like, it's cheaper because you're missing out on some things, really it's cheaper because you're not tying up our facility for a day. We still put a tremendous amount of thought into how it's a valuable proposition to get the online as well.
Yeah. No, I think, for me, it's like the in-person class is going to be what the class makes it, right? And then if you're getting the additional education online, like, I think that's what's really cool. And then, as you told us, like as things change and guidelines update and distilleries grow, like getting that PDF and getting that education on the back end from just like, hey, you're part of the society, you're still going to see the details moving forward. I think that's another great benefit, just being part of the society is being able to get all the valuable information that you all are collecting and putting together, from here until the end of time, per se.
Yeah. And that is one thing that, people think just because we don't have dues and you've got to pay us money every year that, it's just kind of a one and done type of thing. But we've actually, followed through on our brand promise to keep everybody informed. Anytime we update the handbook, we send out the updates or new additions to everybody in the Stave and Thief Society. And we have like private social media channels and groups that you have to be a steward to get in. And man, those are active and passionate and man. And I'm not a social media person, so I have to be shown these things. And every time someone's like, well, this is an argument that's happening on, Facebook right now. I'm like, an argument? And, it's dozens of people like chiming in with opinions and interpretations of the book. And, someone here will be like, you might want to step in and kind of explain this to calm some of these people down. So it is great that we're creating this group. And it's really nice because of that Cross Thieves lapel pin. Anytime I go to a whiskey event, nowadays, more and more, I just look around and I see tons of those little pins everywhere at those events. And I think other people do too. And because I've seen people like just go up and be like, oh, you're a bourbon steward too. And, start talking there. So it is creating a society, which is awesome because that wasn't our initial thought that it was going to be something like that. We picked the Stave and Thief Society name because Colleen, Thomas, and I, who I kind of worked with very closely on creating this when we were workshopping names. The Stave and Thief Society wasn't so much as like, we're trying to create a society of bourbon lovers. We're like, what's going to sound cool? And what's going to, because we ultimately, like all of our iconography, all of our early designs, we wanted it to feel like this, skull and bones. We wanted it to feel like you have to be in the know to understand and know what this is.
Yeah.
Which is what it was at first, but has grown very quickly since then.
So, we've talked a ton about Stave and Thief, and we've talked a ton about the Executive Bourbon Steward. But my question, and this is like the upsell question, is like, so now that someone has done that, what would be the next class if they wanted to continue, growing with Moonshine? What would be that next class that you would recommend someone taking? Like saying, hey, like if you're all in and you really want to invest and maybe you want to get into the industry in some way, shape, or form, what would you say, would be the next class they should take?
So there are 3 classes that on the professional side that it never even occurred to me that someone who came through Stave and Thief would be interested in the professional classes, but we're seeing it more and more these days. And it kind of makes sense because our professional classes are just extremely deep, nerdy dives into various aspects that you learn about to only a certain depth in the Stave and Thief Society. But we're seeing more people come to our fermentation class because people are super interested in that. And I think a little bit of that is also kind of having a whiskey rock star teach that. Dr. Pat Heiss of Wilderness Trail and Firm Solutions teaches that. And he is one of the most brilliant and entertaining people in the industry. So 2 days with him where you just, get a mind dump from him, where it's hilarious the entire time and so engaging, is fantastic. Our barrel aging workshop is something we're seeing more and more people come to because people want to know more about the barrel, what's happening there, the science therein. And we work with Andrew Wiebrink at Independent Stave Company. And Andrew and I were having lunch 5 years ago. And we were talking about how do we teach people about barrel aging? How's that come about where we're talking so topically and we don't have data? And we were just like, well, let's start generating data. So, he gave us 30 experimental barrels. We filled them. And that's different mash bills, different still proofs, different entry proofs, different toasts, different chars, alternate woods. There's 50 different things you taste during that class. And not only do you get to taste it, which there's nowhere else in the world to do that, we actually ran GCMS. So we actually, it goes through a machine where it actually vaporizes all the compounds and lets you know how much of each compound is in there. So you actually get to see the hard analytic data along with testing it. And Andrew's just brilliant. And he gets into every little thing that's happening in the barrel, the environment of the barrel, and how it impacts aging. And we see more and more enthusiasts go through that class because they just want that deeper dive. And then the third one is a 2-day whiskey workshop with Matt Strickland. And Matt is dear friend of the company. He and Clay used to work at Corsair together years and years ago. And Matt has gone on to work and start up several other distilleries, but he's also a content writer and tester for the Institute of Brewing and Distilling, has written several books. I mean, he's just a brilliant guy, and he is also very entertaining. He might even be able to carve out another hour to teach in those 2 days if he cussed a little bit less. But beyond that, brilliant. And we've had people come in because that gets into the different production methodologies, equipment of different whiskeys from around the world, different barrel aging techniques, and a whole bunch of science therein.
I'll say class is much like an appetizer for people that are hungry for the information, and we all know that everyone is.
They really are. Yeah.
I mean, there's so much out there there's so much that I learned, and I went into this class thinking well, I don't even know what I'm going to learn.
Yeah.
And every time it was like, oh, so that's how that works, or oh, so that's why they don't explain it on the tour, because it really does take an hour to explain even the top layer of it.
Yeah. And it's funny because we do get all levels of people in. And I remember we were doing a private class for Bardstown Bourbon Company. And the first one we ever did, so they brought in kind of like the C-level suite, all the production people, and Steve Nally was in that class. And, he is a Bourbon Hall of Fame distiller. He worked at Maker's Mark. He started up Wyoming Whiskey. And then Bardstown Bourbon Company. And Steve is a talent. I mean, he is a big talent, and he sat front and center in that class. So I'm teaching all day and just look down to Steve. And I don't know if you've met Steve or interacted with him much. I'm sure, Jake, you have at the contest. But he's kind of a stoic man.
Yeah.
Very nice. But all day I just saw this very not mean, just pleasant face, but flat. No joke landed, nothing. And then after class, he came up and he's just like, Colin, that was a a great class. Even I learned a thing or two. And I was just like, Steve, you couldn't have smiled once through that entire damn class. Come on, man. Come on, help me out. Because that was probably the most intimidating person I had in class. Him and Steve Beal. He was very intimidating to have in class as well.
Yeah. It's just like bourbon icons like that. Like when I first met Steve, he was very much kind of disarmed because his wife was with him, and she brings the party. And Steve will start bringing out his character and his person because she was around. So I got to meet the more fun Steve, not the stoic Steve, but definitely understand what you're talking about with that stoic thing. As he gave the tour, the stoic, kind of showed up. But I think it's awesome that everyone from all over the industry has come and sat through that. And I think that's what's really telling. It doesn't matter who you are, what level you're at. Like, this is an opportunity for you to learn more about, bourbon and whiskey in general. And so I really appreciate the time that we had with you all just recently, because I think it made me a better just person of understanding of the whiskey in general, and just answering some of the questions, and honestly, I was too afraid to ask along the way because people expected us to know it. So now that I know, I'm a lot happier.
And yeah, thank you for saying that, because that is a big thing. Because as I harp on in my hospitality section, like, there's no reason to be scared. This is a fun, friendly industry, and that's the one thing I'm probably most proud of, is that hospitality aspect. Because I've also had some people in the industry come up to me after class and were like, I've never really thought about, like, not judging people and, not being a snob and all that. But the way you talked about that, like, it makes perfect sense. Why wouldn't you do anything other than be, like, accepting of what someone wants to drink and how they want to drink it, and maybe make recommendations to help them along the path? Because, I early in my career ran into too many whiskey snobs where I'm like, I am not helping anyone who wants to be like this get more educated.
Yeah. Nope. Been there, done that. Ran into many people. Well, we really appreciate, just the opportunity to A, take the class, but B, just to sit down with you right afterwards and decompress and talk about, what it is, because I think people, it doesn't matter where you are on the whiskey spectrum. This is something that if you're seriously wanting to learn more and grow, this is an opportunity. So we like to give our guests an opportunity to just share a little bit about, where they can find out more information about you all and how they might be able to sign up for the class in 2023.
So all of our classes for 2023 are already online and selling for both Moonshine University and Stave and Thief. But you can go to staveandthief.com and see all the programs from certified Bourbon Steward, Executive Bourbon Steward, in person and online, with all the dates therein. And if you're interested in doing a more deep dive in any topic, check out moonshineuniversity.com, because we have a whole variety of classes available every year. And that is well worth checking out. And if you do the social media, all our social media links are on the bottom of both of those web pages.
That's easy enough right there.
Yeah.
Well, Colin, we truly appreciate, your all's hospitality to us. And then, this podcast, it means a lot, because now we know what it's like to be part of Stave and Thief. And Scott, yes, you're better than me, but we'll make it up somehow. I had a test. So
the competition continues.
Yeah. Yep. Never stops. Well, Colin, we appreciate it, you joining us today. As always, thanks everyone for listening to this episode of The Bourbon Lens. You can find out more about us at bourbonlens.com, as well on social media at Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. And last but not least, we have a growing and expanding Patreon community. If you are interested, we have some awesome opportunities in January, February, and March for our tasting club, just $7 a month, to get to hear from distillers and try unique whiskeys like Dalmore or Brush Creek in Wyoming, right? So there's some really cool things that you may not get to see locally that we'll provide to you through that tasting club. And as always, last but not least, go to your favorite podcast listening app, hit subscribe, and give us a 5-star review if you have a chance. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.